My name is Mary Yoder, and I grew up deeply embedded within a strict Lancaster County settlement. We lived by the old ways, where our window screens were forbidden and clocks ran deliberately slow. The morning of my wedding began long before dawn with the heavy, lingering scent of stewed celery. The older women had been boiling enormous pots of traditional Amish wedding roast since the early hours. That rich, savory aroma clung to the walls, settled into my hair, and steeped into my dress. I share this today because some secrets are forced down our throats, disguised as quiet, spiritual obedience. If you have ever felt a room full of loved ones actively hiding reality, you already understand. The absolute truth often leaves a distinct shape in the very spaces where people refuse to look. I sat completely motionless, like a wooden doll, while my mother meticulously pinned my blue wedding cape. Her fingertips felt freezing against my neck, moving with a fast, nervous energy I rarely ever saw. I desperately wanted her to offer some mundane chatter about the changing weather or the cooking food. Instead, she remained utterly silent, just smoothing the heavy fabric and pushing the sharp pins deeply in. Beyond my bedroom window, I could hear the steady crunch of buggy wheels rolling up our lane. Ordinarily, the arrival of our entire community should have filled my young spirit with overwhelming, pure joy. But my mind was entirely focused on my older sister, Rachel, who was supposed to be there. I fully expected her to step through that door and guide me through this terrifying new transition. Rachel was 2 years older, and we had shared the same narrow bed for our entire childhood. We invented a secret language of soft knocks against the plaster wall to communicate in the dark. She was the one who patiently taught me how to weave my hair into tight, proper braids. She also warned me which strict elders to avoid and which gentle women would show me kindness. When I finally whispered her name to my mother, asking for her whereabouts, the room grew cold. My mother's expression suddenly pinched tightly together, like a heavy wooden door being swiftly slammed entirely shut. She claimed Rachel was simply feeling under the weather, but the words spilled out entirely too fast. I swallowed my sudden unease because a proper Amish bride never argues on her special wedding morning. The official ceremony took place inside a massive, freshly swept barn owned by the neighboring Yoder family. Long wooden benches were divided strictly by gender, placing the solemn men opposite the quietly seated women. I walked forward beside Jacob, keeping my gaze respectfully lowered, exactly as I had been rigorously trained. However, I could not resist stealing a quick, desperate glance toward the very front row of women. The exact spot where my sister should have been sitting proudly was glaringly, painfully, and completely empty. Someone had placed an open hymnbook in that void, its spine cracked wide as a pathetic placeholder. Every woman seated nearby had angled her shoulders away from that specific spot, treating it like poison. It felt as though an invisible disease lingered there, and nobody dared to acknowledge the gaping wound. Seeking comfort, I turned my frightened eyes toward Jacob, hoping his familiar presence would calm my panic. Jacob was universally known as a remarkably steady, reliable man who always kept his farm fences mended. When I quietly muttered a question about Rachel, his reaction shattered my fragile sense of wedding security. He stared intensely at the dusty floorboards, muttered a stiff denial, and his ears flushed bright red. I had known this honest boy since infancy, and I was watching him actively lie to me. Meanwhile, the elderly bishop began his booming sermon, filling the cavernous barn with deep, rhythmic, traditional cadences. He preached heavily about a wife's ultimate submission and the divine will of God for married women. I heard his booming voice, but my entire soul remained trapped on that abandoned, lonely wooden bench. Following the vows, the space was quickly transformed to host our massive, traditional Lancaster County wedding feast. We were seated high up at the corner table, displayed prominently for the entire congregation to admire. Being elevated meant I was utterly trapped in the one place where I could not freely investigate. I forced a polite smile, passing heavy bowls of mashed potatoes and that ever-present, fragrant stewed celery. Beneath my quiet exterior, a frantic, buzzing anxiety began vibrating through my chest like an angry hornet. I carefully observed the room, noticing a highly coordinated choreography of avoidance moving among the older women. Whenever a conversation naturally drifted toward my sister, they instantly pivoted to discussing sermons or changing seasons. Their collective silence was so incredibly polished that it formed a perfect, unmistakable outline of Rachel's absence. Once the heavy meal concluded, I cornered her closest friend, Rebecca, while she washed the dirty dishes. When I directly demanded news about Rachel, all the healthy color instantly drained from her young face. She stammered a frantic excuse about helping her mother, wiping her dripping hands on her dry apron. She practically ran away from the metal washtubs, leaving me staring at the murky, soapy water. Desperate for truth, I quietly approached my Aunt Martha, who cheerfully claimed Rachel was visiting distant relatives. Barely moments later, my Uncle Samuel solemnly informed me that poor Rachel was resting sick at home. Two completely different, equally confident lies were handed to me by the people I trusted most deeply. Nobody dared speak the dreaded word used for those who permanently abandon our strict, closed religious fellowship. The glaring absence of that specific forbidden word screamed louder than any physical shout across the barn. Suddenly, fragmented memories from the past few weeks started crashing into my mind with terrifying, perfect clarity. I remembered Rachel staring at me with profound, unspoken sorrow, as if desperately memorizing my face forever. She had packed a tiny bag, vaguely mentioning a quilting bee, but her eyes had looked hollow. Needing fresh air, I slipped toward the massive barn doors where the men were tending the horses. Just outside in the cooling dusk, I heard Jacob and my father speaking in hushed, serious tones. My father firmly stated my name, followed by a low, heavy sentence I could not quite decipher. My leather shoe crunched against the loose gravel, and both men instantly snapped their mouths completely shut. They spun around simultaneously, plastering incredibly fake, ordinary smiles onto their faces just for my naive benefit. Standing there, inhaling the scent of horses and twilight, a freezing realization finally settled into my bones. When I had questioned Jacob earlier, he never asked when she vanished or who she went with. He had not stumbled over the shocking news because he already possessed the full, devastating truth himself. The only logical explanation was that my missing sister had spoken directly to him before she fled. I stared across the dusty yard at my new husband, and he was already staring right back. In that silent exchange, I realized he had been nervously waiting for this exact confrontation all day. I made a silent, ironclad vow that I would extract the absolute, real answers from him tonight. We traveled homeward through the suffocating darkness, while the buggy wheels violently struck every single deep rut. Jacob held the heavy leather reins tightly, while the swinging lantern cast erratic shadows across the brush. Neither of us spoke a single word during that agonizing journey down the desolate country dirt road. I patiently waited, because enduring absolute silence eventually forces a guilty conscience to confess its hidden sins. The freezing night air whipped against my blue wedding dress as I stared at his tense profile. Finally, he abruptly halted our tired horse right in the middle of the completely abandoned gravel path. He turned toward my shivering frame and released a deeply shaky breath into the frigid night air. This incredibly stoic man suddenly completely faltered, and that terrifying vulnerability frightened me beyond all rational comprehension. He softly admitted that Rachel had secretly visited him exactly 3 agonizing weeks before our wedding day. My beloved sister had absolutely not been banished by the strict church elders for any supposed sins. She boldly chose to pack her meager belongings and permanently escape into the modern English world instead. Rachel successfully fled toward the bustling streets of Philadelphia to finally claim her own independent human existence. The shocking realization that she voluntarily abandoned our isolated community completely shattered my incredibly fragile emotional state. She willingly sacrificed our profound, lifelong bond because remaining trapped inside the settlement felt intimately like dying. Jacob solemnly explained that this devastating departure was merely the very first part of his terrible confession. The second shocking revelation felt simultaneously like a vicious betrayal and a profoundly beautiful act of love. Rachel desperately approached my future husband because she genuinely feared the crushing weight of our religious traditions. She absolutely refused to sit there and silently endorse a marriage destined to slowly extinguish my spirit. My brave sister aggressively begged Jacob to boldly reject the intensely oppressive customs governing our local wives. She passionately pleaded with him to fiercely protect my independent voice against the community's suffocating cultural expectations. During her final desperate hours among our people, she fiercely advocated for my future freedom and happiness. She sacrificed her own remaining precious moments just to secure a slightly better existence for my soul. Knowing she fought so incredibly hard for my personal autonomy brought fresh, hot tears to my eyes. However, the final devastating piece of his long confession completely destroyed any remaining illusion of marital trust. Shortly after Rachel vanished, our strict church elders quickly discovered her secret parting conversation with my groom. My own respected father immediately joined these powerful men to forcefully demand absolute silence from young Jacob. They genuinely feared that knowing the absolute truth would immediately compel me to cancel the entire wedding. These respected leaders systematically orchestrated a massive deception to ensure I remained perfectly obedient and completely ignorant. They explicitly instructed my future husband to completely hide this monumental tragedy until the final vows concluded. Jacob actively participated in their cruel illusion throughout the lengthy ceremony and the massive celebratory evening feast. Every single time I frantically searched that totally empty wooden bench, he deliberately maintained his cowardly silence. My supposedly reliable protector willingly prioritized their rigid patriarchal authority over my fundamental right to basic honesty. I desperately want to avoid painting him as a purely evil monster, because reality remains much messier. He was systematically raised to genuinely believe that blind obedience to older men equaled pure religious devotion. Our community constantly teaches that protecting a fragile woman from painful truths demonstrates profound godly masculine love. He never maliciously intended to break my trusting heart when he agreed to their incredibly manipulative demands. Yet sitting inside that freezing buggy, I finally understood the terrifying hierarchy governing our brand new marriage. When forced to choose between the powerful church elders and his naive young bride, he chose them. My heavy blue dress suddenly felt like a suffocating theatrical costume designed for a completely predetermined tragedy. I had blindly promised ultimate submission to a community that fundamentally viewed me as an ignorant child. Jacob carefully reached deep inside his dark wool coat and slowly withdrew a heavily creased white envelope. He confessed that Rachel had explicitly delivered this secret letter directly into my hands. My name was beautifully written across the front, using the exact elegant script she had taught me. I felt utterly terrified to finally discover what my brilliant sister desperately needed me to deeply understand. I absolutely refused to gently open the delicate paper while sitting beside the man who betrayed me. We finished the agonizing journey in total silence until we reached our newly gifted, incredibly modest farmhouse. I immediately grabbed a single flickering candle and firmly locked myself inside the tiny, freezing back bedroom. Sitting upon an unfamiliar quilt, I finally unfolded the precious message my beloved sister had carefully written. The trembling golden candlelight danced frantically across the page as my anxious eyes devoured her brief words. She profoundly apologized for missing the wedding, but insisted that leaving was completely necessary for her survival. Rachel explicitly clarified that she was completely abandoning a suffocating lifestyle, not maliciously rejecting our sisterly love. She eloquently described how the rigid community rules were slowly forcing her vibrant personality to permanently disappear. Then I read the single most important sentence that completely revolutionized my entire perspective on human existence. She passionately commanded me to fiercely guard my true yes and my true no against any manipulation. Rachel brilliantly declared that those two simple words are the absolute only things we truly own forever. I stared at that incredibly profound wisdom while the melting wax slowly dripped onto the wooden floorboards. They had deliberately allowed me to make a massive lifelong commitment while completely blindfolded by their lies. My wise sister clearly recognized that our culture continuously managed women through gentle coercion disguised as spiritual guidance. I slowly emerged from that freezing bedroom and easily found Jacob anxiously waiting beside the small kitchen table. I firmly asked him what he would ultimately choose whenever those strict church elders demanded his absolute silence. He stared at the floorboards without answering, and that painful hesitation permanently altered our entire marital dynamic. The deepest emotional wound was their collective assumption that I remained far too incredibly weak to handle reality. Early the next bright morning, I boldly marched back into that massive barn and permanently closed the hymn book. Every single older woman stared in absolute shock as I publicly refused to tolerate their toxic, silent games. That seemingly minor act of bold defiance permanently transformed me into a woman who demands absolute truth. I slowly started setting firm boundaries and asking the difficult questions I used to politely swallow whole. If you ever sense your loved ones actively hiding reality, please remember my terrifying wedding day experience. You are absolutely never too fragile or insignificant to handle the raw truth about your own existence. Please fiercely guard your personal yes and your personal no, because they guarantee your fundamental human freedom. Never let anyone comfortably steer your own precious life, while falsely claiming they act from pure, unselfish love. You can explore my complete journey toward independence by easily purchasing my new personal memoir, available online today. Find the direct link to buy Everything the Fence Kept In inside the description and pinned comment.